Hello there and welcome to The Defender, Wisconsin's environmental podcast. I'm Amy Barrilleaux. The Defender is powered by Clean Wisconsin, your environmental voice since 1970. So I'm going to take you on a little trip back in time. 9 years ago, people living in Marinette and Peshtigo found out that toxic PFAS forever chemicals from nearby Tyco fire products had been contaminating their drinking water wells and waterways for years. 3 years later, people living in the town of Campbell near La Crosse discovered that their private wells were contaminated with PFAS coming from the airport where firefighting foam was used for training. Then, in January of 2023, people living in the town of Stella found out that their wells and waterways were contaminated with toxic PFAS that was in biosludge from a nearby paper mill that was spread on potato fields across the area for years. Then, later in 2023, help from Wisconsin lawmakers finally arrived. Sort of. Bipartisan budget legislation created a $125 million pot of money for cleanup, funding for emergency bottled water, and grants to rebuild contaminated wells. Except then came gridlock because a Republican bill to spend that money included a provision that could let PFAS polluters off the hook. So here we are, almost 3 years later, with communities all across Wisconsin still waiting on help from state lawmakers. But is all the waiting almost over? On this episode, some real hope that a bipartisan solution is at hand and the industry that is coming in at the last minute to try to kill it. That's right now on The Defender. Lots of activity at the Capitol over the last week as Republicans introduce an amendment to their spending bill for PFAS aid. It's an amendment that Clean Wisconsin and the governor support, but there is another hurdle, this time from an industry group, and time is running out. Joining me is Clean Wisconsin Government Relations Director Erik Kanter. Erik, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get into the deep dive about what's going on with this PFAS bill and the long struggle to get help for people in Wisconsin, I want to talk a little bit about what you do every day. I mean, you're going into the Wisconsin legislature, one of the most divided places I feel like that you could possibly be, and you're trying to get lawmakers to help the environment. What is that like as a job?
It can be difficult. Some days are better than others. As you said, we are in a very divided state and a very divided government and divided legislature. The environment's not going to advocate for itself, so somebody needs to do it. And it's certainly why we're all here at Clean Wisconsin. And the role that I play in that larger effort is to go into the legislature and see how far we can get things. And often it's small incremental change in this sort of environment. But, just keep chipping away. And I can't dwell too much on the bad days or else it'd be hard to come into work the next day. So it's just about keeping your head down and doing what you can each and every day, a little bit at a time.
I think sometimes we think about the legislature or Congress as like very black and white, there's no give on certain issues. But are you finding that sometimes there is interest in protecting the environment or protecting people's health from pollutants in surprising offices in the legislature or in Congress?
Yeah, I would say that on the water side of the work that we do, I think there's more room for bipartisan effort on water issues. And that's because, so many Republicans represent rural areas, and those folks in rural areas are getting the drinking water from private wells, and those private wells are contaminated from nitrates, from PFAS, bacteria. And so, these are real issues that Republicans are seeing in their districts, and they need to be dealt with. And I think fundamentally, everyone pretty much understands the importance of clean drinking water. And so on the water side of things, I would say the world is not so black and white, and there's a lot of opportunity across the political spectrum. I'd say on our energy side of work, it is a little bit different. That's a little bit more of a politically charged area as far as we're, related to renewables and what they think about using renewables for base load and land use issues and things along those lines. So energy is a little more difficult, perhaps a bit more black and white, but on the water side of things, not quite as partisan.
How do you not feel, I guess, tied up in knots with frustration every day, because certainly the people who you're fighting for, the folks in Peshtigo and Marinette and places all across Wisconsin who have been waiting now for years for this money. I mean, it's sitting there, sitting in a bank account to come and help them, start to fight the contamination in their communities. This has been such a long journey, and it's still not over.
I feel very, very frustrated for those folks. And even, this bill that is moving through the process right now is the best bill we've seen yet from Republican authors on PFAS. It still doesn't give them everything they need, and they're still feeling sort of let down by where we are even today on this bill. And so it's really frustrating for those folks. And that frustration gets to me every day whenever I talk about the issue and whenever I talk to those individuals, because it's not that they're passionate about the issue. They're obviously passionate about the issue, but they're living with the issue. And it's a day-to-day thing that they are forced to deal with because of actions taken in their community by polluters that put them in this situation. And so it's frustrating. But again, I think part of my role here is to understand the pace of the legislature and the pace at which bills move. And so, there are a lot of bills that I've seen in my over a dozen years doing this that have taken multiple sessions to get across the finish line. And you'd think on something like PFAS, where this is a big issue happening right now, this needs to be taken care of as quickly as we can. And unfortunately, the way that the legislature works, that's just not always the case. And as we've seen here, that's not the case. And so I find it incredibly frustrating that they can't just get their act together, but also this slow pace is not something that surprises me.
So when we talk about the bill, when it first came out, we and many other folks across the state were concerned because it appeared to give polluters kind of an exemption under the spills law in Wisconsin. So you might have somebody who polluted a community and then doesn't have to do anything to help clean it up. Were Republicans surprised when they got so much pushback about that portion of the bill?
They were, because they thought that at the time in the original bill, it was called the innocent landowner provisions. They thought they had written the innocent landowner provisions in a way to where they weren't letting polluters off the hook. And that just wasn't the case. And we, Clean Wisconsin, talked to them about that early on last year in 2025 when the bill first came out about, we get that you guys don't see it this way, but when we read the language, here's what we see and here's how this could be interpreted. And through good faith conversations and talking to those authors, we got them to see things our way, and engaged in conversations with them and with drafting attorneys in the legislature of really trying to tighten up this language to help them achieve their intentions of perhaps not going after, I think, what most people would consider quote unquote passive receivers, which are people who kind of take in PFAS in a waste stream and put that waste stream back out without really adding to it or making it worse themselves. And so the bill as it is today sort of arrived at tightening up that language to really be intentional about what is a passive receiver. But the bill as originally written had, we said, and a lot of folks said, the governor said at the time last session, just flat out loopholes. And it took a lot of time and a lot of conversations to really help the authors see that these were in fact loopholes, these were in fact problems. And so the bill's in a very different place today because of conversations that we had with the authors back in 2025. And so we're proud of that work, but there's still, I think, still more work to be done.
So we have an amendment to the bill that seems to tighten up those loopholes to kind of an acceptable level. So, you see that amendment, you're like, all right, let's go. Let's get this thing done. And yet here we are still talking about this because I guess paper companies now are not happy and Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce is not happy. And it feels like PFAS is sort of this hot potato, like nobody wants to be associated with it and everybody wants that protection. Is that kind of what's going on?
Yeah, what happened yesterday at the assembly hearing was the paper industry really showed up in force at the hearing and made the argument that at least some of their paper mills are what they proclaim themselves to be passive receivers. And so they felt singled out and targeted, that paper mills weren't going to be treated in that sort of passive receiver definition. And it really threw a wrench into the whole process. And there were a lot of committee members sympathetic to their argument. And so we are today. I think the Assembly Environment Committee wants to vote on the bill next week. I think a week from today, so 7 days from now, and we really only have 7 days to figure this language out, because time is running out very quickly on the legislative session. The Assembly wants to be done on February 19th. The Senate wants to be done on sometime in March, probably March 19th, and so we need to get this through the Assembly in less than a month, and every day counts. And so this language really needs to be figured out quickly if there is going to be a fix for the paper industry that Clean Wisconsin can live with, that the governor can live with, that the DNR can live with. And so time is really of the essence. And yesterday's hearing was not helpful in simply ushering this good new amendment through the process.
So the paper thing is significant because you have the town of Stella, which has, I would say horrifying levels of PFAS that were discovered really on accident by DNR just doing random sampling. And then they discovered these, really one of the worst PFAS hotspots in the entire country in this tiny town of Stella, where PFAS contaminated paper sludge had been spread all around them. And I believe they're suing the paper mill that was spread all that sludge. So how hard is it for folks who are living with this contamination to sit here and see industries coming in and saying, well, we need an exemption, we need to be taken care of, when these families are waiting to be taken care of?
I think it's not a great look for the industry to be doing this, given what's going on in the town of Stella. I mean, the reality is that PFAS is there because of waste that came out of a paper mill at the end of the day. And it's unclear, when that waste was spread. I'm sure it was decades ago, and it was done over decades and just added to. And so, perhaps there's not new waste being added now from paper mills, but, this is a forever chemical. It's in the groundwater. If the spreading happened yesterday or 50 years ago. There weren't any folks there from the town of Stella yesterday. There actually weren't any community members at the hearing yesterday. I think if there were individuals from Stella at the hearing yesterday, I think it would have been a very frustrating process, a very frustrating meeting for them to sit through. And so, again, it's frustrating because any language that we can agree to, or DNR or the governor can agree to, needs to make sure that the entity who did that in Stella cannot get off the hook through whatever language might come out. We need to make sure that any community that's found to have contamination in the future that was caused by a paper mill can't get off the hook. And so if we're going to move forward on some sort of workaround for paper mills, the language needs to be very, very, very narrow to ensure that these are indeed passive receivers. Ideally, the paper mills need to, I don't know if it's testing water that's coming into the mill and then testing the water that's going back out and maintaining those records and proving to the DNR that they are indeed passive receivers. So the language needs to be very, very tight. And I think there needs to be some requirements of the paper mills to prove that indeed the waste going out does not have new PFAS in it, if this is going to work for everybody.
I think this whole situation points to a larger nationwide issue with PFAS, which is, we've got these chemicals that don't break down in the environment that we've been producing for 80 or 90 years that we're starting to see pretty much everywhere, on our food crops, in our food system, in our water. They're pervasive. And the tab to clean all that up, to take care of people's health, is starting to get bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point where we really can't afford it. And we're still producing PFAS. So, when we're here looking at this, relatively small amount of money to help very specific communities in the state, and we can't even do that because there's this fear of being tied to the liability of this horrible thing. How do we think about moving forward on the bigger picture issue?
I mean, that is the thing here. It feels like we're at this moment on this bill where perhaps there is some momentum to get something to the governor's desk that he can sign, and that feels really important because, the legislature created this trust fund over 2.5 years ago where they set aside $125 million. I believe there's about $140 million in it now, and so, passing this bill would enable access to those dollars for communities and citizens throughout the state to get the help that they need. And that feels very important, and it is very important because it's taken so much time to do this. However, in the grand scheme of things, it's sort of a drop in the bucket in the total, policy issues that need to be addressed on PFAS. We need to still address how PFAS even gets into the waste stream in the first place. I think that's the next big place to go, and I think that is going to be a bigger fight than this one potentially. And so, as much as this could feel like a victory if we get this bill passed, there's still a lot of work to do to ensure that this contamination never gets into communities again.
I mean, it will feel like a victory after the 2 years of work to get something done in Wisconsin. But I think after every victory, there's always what's next. And so part of what's next, I think, is a groundwater standard too here in Wisconsin. So what would that, I guess, do for us as a state?
So the groundwater standard is important for anybody who's on a private well for their drinking water, which is 1/3 of the state. So a significant portion, a lot of those people are in Republican districts, and so this should be an issue that Republicans want to address. But really, it would ensure that it would sort of have an upwards effect of really dialing in what can be spread in biosolids, because it's the biosolids being spread on ag land, frankly, that is getting down into the water table and down into private wells. And so it would lead to much better practices in biosolid spreading in what's coming out of wastewater treatment centers that's being turned into biosolids spread on land. We'd have biosolids with far, 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 far less PFAS, creating far less contamination in the environment if we can get that groundwater standard. And so it's the last piece of the puzzle, at least on water standards go. We have a drinking water standard for municipal drinking water systems. We have a surface water standard for lakes, rivers. We don't have a groundwater standard, despite being very close to getting one about 5 years ago that was sort of killed in the 11th hour at the Natural Resources Board. And so this is something that people in Marinette and Peshtigo, Stella, town of Campbell, have been waiting for a long, long time. And it's something they need, it's something they deserve, and it will just lead to far better biosolid spreading practices in the future.
We talk about getting a win, at the legislature or wherever. What else are you working on beyond PFAS? Because I think those PFAS wins are really hard for all the reasons we just talked about. The liability, the fact that it's everywhere, the fact that the costs for cleanup and containment are astronomical. Are there any bills or future things happening at the legislature that could be hey, we can get both parties behind, and this is going to be good for our environment?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that Clean Wisconsin has worked on for decades now is nitrate contamination in drinking water. And I think nitrates have lost a little bit of the spotlight since PFAS came on the scene back in 2017. And PFAS is an issue we needed to address. However, I think we took our eye off the ball a little bit on nitrates. And so there's a lot of work to be done on nitrates, and a lot of that has to do with the agricultural industry and trying to create incentives for farmers to implement conservation practices on their farms that leads to less nitrate, less manure, frankly, getting into the water table and down into private wells. And that can be a hot button issue with obviously the agricultural industry, but if it's done in a way where farmers are really part of that process and want to buy into that process and have help to implement those practices, I think there's a lot of bipartisan support for that kind of work.
Is it helpful for people listening to this to contact their lawmakers and say, hey, we want you to support getting money for PFAS protections to communities, or to support, safe drinking water, or any of these things? Or how much do those kind of calls really help, or does it depend on what the issue is?
I think it depends on on the issue, and it depends on sort of the timing in the legislative session. When we're talking about funding, a lot of the time, take those agricultural practices that require dollars to be funneled to farmers. That's a state budget process issue, and so that happens in the sort of January to June type timeline of odd numbered years, and so we're past that at the moment. However, on this bill related to PFAS right now, it still needs to get the PFAS bill needs to get through committee in the Senate, and it needs to get through committee in the Assembly. And so if you're someone living in a district where your representative or your senator is on one of those committees, I think it could help a lot to make some phone calls and reach out to those individuals and ask them to bring those bills up for a vote. And then when it's through the committee process, it'll go to the floor of both houses. And at that time, sort of a statewide call to support that bill, I think is really helpful and can go a long way.
So if we get to that point, we'll issue an action alert to all of our followers, certainly, and make sure that they know who to contact. One thing I wanted to talk about, it doesn't really have anything directly to do with the environment, are these new-ish rules. Since WSI in the legislature, that's kind of been our C-SPAN of the state, has, folded, I guess, run out of funding, didn't get more funding from the legislature. Folks are not allowed to, unless they're a credentialed member of the media registered with the Department of Administration, are not allowed to record these committee hearings. What's that change been like? Have you noticed any change? Does it feel kind of like things are happening more in the shadows now?
Everybody's talking about it, and by everybody I mean lobbyists and staff members, and I think it's made it more difficult for the media to do its job because at this time in the session when things are wrapping up, there are a lot of committees happening concurrently, and in the past perhaps a reporter could go to a committee and watch that hearing happen and then get back to their office and watch the replay of a committee hearing that they missed that they wanted to report on as well. That's not happening anymore, and so you have to be in the room, and so I think it is causing problems, at least for the media, in really comprehensively reporting on every issue the legislature is working on. For the public, it's obviously a problem to not be able to tune in from home and see what's going on. I mentioned the individuals, community members in Marinette and Peshtigo and Stella and Campbell weren't able to be at the hearing yesterday. I'm sure they would have liked to watch it. And they just weren't able to. So it's creating a lot of problems for people who work in Madison, but certainly creating issues for people out in the public who just want to watch what their government is doing, and that that's part of a good open government. It's my understanding that both houses are trying to come to some sort of agreement here before the end of session to get Wisconsin I back up and running again. That's the rumor, at least, but I don't know what that looks like. I don't think anybody other than the folks in those talks really know what that might look like. But I think it's pretty clear that there's bipartisan recognition that this kind of service for the state is important and it needs to get back up and running soon.
Well, we're going to go ahead and fill out the form for the Defender to get credentialed media so we can at least cover some of these things that are important, at least to our listeners and our supporters here at Clean Wisconsin. Erik, thank you so much for taking the time to go through all this long, complicated journey with me, and we'll just stay tuned for next steps.
Sounds great. Thank you.
And thank you for listening to The Defender. Remember to like and review on your favorite podcast app and share with your friends. It helps other people find the show. And to stay in the loop on any legislation or issue where your voice can make a difference, join our Action Network, cleanwisconsin.org/action. I'm Amy Barrilleaux. Talk to you later.